Let's talk about hedonism. Hedon comes from the Attic Greek and it means pleasure. Hedonism is the value of pleasure. When you're talking about hedonism, there's two different major fields you might be within. You might be within ethics because hedonism comes up in ethics. You might also be within the realm of psychology. So when we're talking about psychology, we're talking about what motivates human beings. And psychological hedonism is basically the idea that human beings are motivated by the value of pleasure. On the other hand, in ethical hedonism, the idea is that pleasure has intrinsic value. So when you're trying to decide what you should and should not do, what's ethical, what's moral, you'll always find people who are trying to bring about pleasure when they're bringing about moral outcomes. Those are basically the two major realms within which hedonism comes up. Let's dive a little bit deeper. So if hedonism basically says that the chief good in life is pleasure, that means two basic things. One, you should seek to minimize pain, which is the opposite of pleasure, and on the other hand, you should seek to maximize pleasure. There's a philosopher whose name is Jeremy Bentham, and he is famous for writing that pain and pleasure govern what we should do, what we should not do. Jeremy Bentham is the founder of a normative ethical theory called utilitarianism that has hedonism as its underlying value theory. So let's discuss that, but break it down. So normative means that we're getting a claim about what should be, about what should happen. And what's normative relates to some standard, because the only way for you to say that something should happen is if you have a standard for what is good and bad, or true and false. And so you need a value. When you make normative claims like you should not use the color black if you're painting a happy image, you should not play happy music at a funeral, you should not lie on an exam, you should, when you say should and should not, when you make normative claims, you need an underlying value so that we can justify what we're saying is good or is bad. And so that's what hedonism comes in and does. I'm going to show you some different ways in which hedonism is the underlying value theory in the normative ethical theory, and then you can better understand what hedonism is really doing. So there's lots of different normative ethical theories: virtue ethics, deontology, natural law, divine command theory. Utilitarianism is one example of a normative ethical theory, and in utilitarianism, you're supposed to maximize the pleasure of the majority. So in utilitarianism, your goal in life is to do whatever it takes to increase the well-being and pleasure of the most amount of affected beings involved that you count and are trying to produce a good outcome for. So utilitarianism is a theory in ethics about what you should and should not do. And what's the value that utilitarians have? It's hedonistic. It's that pleasure is a good, it's an intrinsic good, and what we should be doing is whatever increases the pleasure for the majority. Here's another normative ethical view, divine command theory. And this one tells us that God's commands are our moral obligations. In divine command theory, you also have hedonism as the underlying value theory. When you're trying to do whatever pleases God, you are saying that pleasure is valuable. Whose pleasure? Not the majority of human beings, but the pleasure of God. So if you're a divine command theorist and you believe that what you should and should not do is whatever God says you should and should not do, then you are also hedonistic because you're trying to bring about results that have God happy. Here's another normative ethical theory, and it's deontology. This is not a hedonistic theory. In deontology, your goal in life is to follow the categorical imperative that's given to us by our rational will. In deontology, your rational will is what commands righteous acts. And deontology does not at all consider what feels good or is pleasurable when deciding what is the right thing to do. So hedonism, again, is just the idea that you should value pleasure, that you should seek to maximize pleasure and minimize pain. And then there's different theories in ethics, for example, about whose pleasure you should be increasing. If you think that you should seek pleasure for the individual, then you're an egoist. If you think you should seek pleasure for the majority in the moral community, you're a utilitarian. If you think you should seek pleasure for God, then that puts you in the camp of a divine command theorist. So these different normative theories, egoism, divine command theory, utilitarianism, each one is normative. It tells you what you should and should not do, but always the goal is to maximize pleasure. And so for divine command theory and for egoism and for utilitarianism, those three normative ethical theories have hedonism as its underlying theory, because hedonism just tells you that pleasure is an inherent good, a value in its own right. And that's basically the idea of hedonism. It's that you should be doing whatever increases pleasure, that pleasure is a chief good in life.